All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about panning in this session and how come it's so important and how panning and EQing go hand in hand. So, and there's going to be a few other things that I put in this video. I think that will be helpful for you, so be sure to watch it. All right, so panning, when you think of panning, think of it like this. I'm just going to load an effect onto I'm just going to create a new blank audio track so I can give you a visual here. And I'm going to just load in one of my plugins here. I have a lot of plugins. S1 Imager. So this is just for a visual representation here of what I'm talking about. All right, so when you talk about a stereo field, you're talking about a 180-degree spectrum in which an instrument can be placed. This is when we talk about stereo. Think of stereo, and this is just in case some of you don't know, the difference between a mono signal and a stereo signal is a mono signal is one signal of audio. That same signal coming out of two speakers at the same time, equally, right down the center, is a mono signal. Stereo signals, which you have in your car, your stereo, your headphones, everything else is stereo. So you have a left side and a right side, and both of those sides carry different information. They have different sounds on them, different amounts of those sounds on them, especially when it comes to music. And the idea is that if we can utilize this 180-degree stereo field and place instruments within that field at different various places, then we can have a really nice, big, wide sounding mix. And one of the benefits, and one of the main benefits in my perspective, when panning is to keep in mind what you did when you were EQing. So, and doing it at the same time. So if you're EQing, say, a hi-hat like I was in the last video, that I was boosting, let's say, hypothetically, I believe it was about 8,000 or 8 kilohertz. So 8,000 hertz, 8 kilohertz. I was boosting 8,000 kilohertz. And I can pull up an EQ to show you that. Alright, so I was boosting, let's say, 8 kilohertz, somewhere in there. And I'm also going to change this type to a bell. Alright, so I'm boosting 8 kilohertz. So now, when I'm going into my other instruments, say my grand piano, I might also really want to boost 8 kilohertz. Normally, what I would probably want to do is, I'm going to just type in 8 kilohertz. Oops, that didn't work. So let's go in there, somewhere in there. And also change this to the bell. Alright, so now if I wanted to also boost this frequency in my grand piano, well, I've got it. Let's say this is a different track, my hi-hat, and I have also got that 8 kilohertz boosted. Well, now I know for sure that these two instruments are going to be competing for that same frequency range. So what's going to happen is they're going to sound really muddy, and they might cancel each other out, and it's not going to sound very good. So normally what I'd do is pull this frequency out of my grand piano a little bit, and maybe you don't have to go extreme. I might pull a little bit out and duck that 8,000 or that 8 kilohertz, just so I'm sure that my hi-hat is coming through. Alright, well, when we start panning instruments, and I'm just going to pull this big view down. When we start to pan instruments by using our panning option here, then what we're doing is think of this 180-degree field. I'm now sending this instrument off to the right-hand side, So now only this speaker is really picking up most of that frequency, this 8,000 kilohertz that's in the, or this 8 kilohertz that's in the hi-hat. So now when I come to my grand piano, if I also pan it, maybe the opposite side, well, now I have these speakers that are independently playing that frequency. So then I can go back to my EQ8 on my grand piano and boost that 8 kilohertz that I want, because I've separated them through stereo imaging, through panning. So I'm utilizing this 180-degree field to also separate instruments by competing frequencies. It can also be something that you customize, so just keep that in mind. So one of the biggest benefits, I'm going to ask this, one of the benefits to panning is that you can now have more space for competing frequencies to be separated. So if I've boosted 8,000 kilohertz on my hi-hat, and I also really want to boost 8,000 kilohertz, or I have a competing already by naturally I have an instrument that is kind of sitting in that 8,000 or 8 kilohertz range, then I can separate them by panning. And if we switch over to the arrangement view, our panning adjustment controls here will actually give us a percentage. So I'm 27 to the right. It goes all the way to 50. So if we go 50 right, that's all the way right. 100, it's actually 100% right. But we only have 100% of the stereo field, so it's 50%. So 50% right, and we can also go 50% left, or anywhere in between. So this is just a visual representation of that 180-degree field. You can go through and place instruments in different parts of that stereo field. You can also adjust how much they come through. So for instance, how loud they are, how wide they are. So panning, stereo imaging is going to give you a little bit more of this aspect of widening sounds, and this is called Stereo Imager here, and this plugin allows you to do this. But I'm just kind of showing you that for sure with volume you can adjust how far something sounds or how close. You can also use other effects like reverb, which I would recommend you start looking into some reverbs. I'll talk about reverbs in another lesson. But anyway, so you can start to utilize this stereo field. Start to take it up. Start to pan things left and start to pan things right. What can get complicated with this, though? One thing I will say that can get complicated with it is that if you're using samples, samples are pre-recorded. Excuse me. If you're using loops, more generally like loops, for instance, in the other session that I have been using, I have a drum loop, but it has every component to the drums within that loop. So I can't go in and only adjust the kick drum. I can't go in and only adjust the snare or the hi-hat, or I can't adjust the panning of any of those individual instruments. It's all just one track. It's one stereo track. So I don't have a lot of control over what I do with the panning of that kind of sample. But one thing I wanted to show you about the drum rack, so if you're using the drum rack, you'll notice that there's a little tab that pops out right here on the side of the track in the session view and in the, let's see if it works in the arrangement view as well. No, I don't think so. So in the session view, which is our kind of more of our mixing view, what it's done is if I look at the drum rack, I've loaded the drum components into this rack. So I loaded all the sounds. I built my own rack. And then I played it. So let's just solo this drum kit. We can look at the MIDI information. Alright, cool. So we've got our kick drum, snare, another kick drum, a snare, a couple different hi-hats, an open hi-hat and a closed hi-hat, and then a hi-hat brush or British vintage 18 stick whatever. Okay, so we have all these different elements to our drum kit. The cool thing about the drum rack is that it still allows us to break the individual parts of it into their own independent tracks. So although it's a drum kit only taking up one track, I still have control over how I mixed each of the elements. Because one thing you want to think about when you're recording audio, especially when we go into the studio, is that isolation is key to having a really good and clean mix. Now, maybe that's not everyone's style, but if you want something to sound really polished and produced, you want to have isolation on every single thing. Your kick drum, your snare drum, your hi-hat, your overheads, your toms on the drums, and then your vocals. You want only your vocal track. When you're playing a guitar, you want only that guitar track rather than everything playing at once and bleeding into each other. So what's really neat about this drum rack is it gives us individual controls over each of the instruments that we've used in it, each of the samples. So I have a volume control for all of them. I have an on-off switch for all of them, a solo, and a panning. So when I start panning a drum kit, I start thinking about, okay, what if I was in the audience and I was listening to this drum kit? I'm going to hear the kick drum right down the center, and a kick drum should always be right down the center. You always want your kicks to really be equal in both speakers so that they're full and effective because they're driving the song. So your kick drum and usually your bass instruments, your main vocals as well, are usually mixed straight down the center. Pretty much everything else is going to be somewhere else in the stereo spectrum. So I can go through here and start playing with. I'm just going to pretend I'm sitting in front of this drum kit. My kick drum would be down the center. I'd be hearing the snare drum a little more off to my right-hand side. Another kick drum that I've used in this session, I would also hear down the center. Another snare drum, so I'd probably also hear this off to the right-hand side, unless I also have it playing at the same time as this snare drum. I'll just have to listen to the beat. And then I've got two hi-hats, which would also be off to my right side, and another hi-hat that would probably be off to my right side. But I want this to feel wide. I want to open up the stereo spectrum on this drum kit. So let's just listen to it and I'll start playing around with panning. I'm going to set this kick back to 0. Now this sounds so much more three-dimensional, and I don't know if it's coming through on your speakers, but it sounds so much more three-dimensional. It sounds like I'm sitting in front of a drummer. I can hear certain things off to my right, certain things off to my left, and some things right down the center. So we can start to do this with our whole mix, and I don't have any idea what I have on this grand piano track. This is something I did, I don't know, I just opened up an old session, so I really don't know what's on here. I guess I've got that soloed. So I can also start to pan this grand piano, and in fact, if I wanted to, I could duplicate it. I'm just going to duplicate the track, and I'm going to select this, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select all these notes, and I'm just going to change them. Maybe I want to do an E3. And I can start to pan these. So I'll have maybe the E3 off to the right and the F3 off to the left. I'll press stop. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Sounds terrible. But you get the idea. Another cool thing about this, though, is you can, you can go through and change, keys. You could probably create some chords. Anyhow, I'm just goofing around now. But the idea is to really start opening up the mix and start really utilizing the stereo field, the 180-degree stereo field, so that you can have more room for competing frequencies to be separated. It also widens your mix and makes the mix sound way more three-dimensional. So my suggestion is that when you're listening to your favorite song, next time you're listening to it in your car or in your headphones, you really pay attention to what's panned on which side. Take one headphone off of your ear, put it back on, take the other earphone off, and see the difference. There's always going to be a difference. So this is how you're able to get more range out of the frequency spectrum and the 180-degree stereo spectrum. This is why panning is important. It'll make your mix sound so much wider, so much bigger, and my suggestion is to really play around with it. And it's not going to work as well on samples that contain multiple instruments, like a drum kit. So yeah, I'm going to show you guys something really neat with samples probably in the next lesson. All right. I think that's it for now.